The champagne flutes shattered in slow motion, crystal fragments catching the late afternoon sun like 1,000 tiny blades. Vivian Ashford stood frozen in her ruined Hermes gown, $18,000 of crimson silk, darkening to the color of old blood as Moët pooled at her feet. Her hand was still raised, fingers trembling from the force of the slap she'd just delivered. The entire dining room of the Onyx Hall had gone silent. 200 conversations dying mid-sentence as Manhattan's elite turned to watch a waitress bleed. But to understand how a woman in a stained polyester uniform became the catalyst for a billionaire's reckoning, you have to go back 7 days. 7 days to a different kind of silence, the kind that lived in studio apartments in Queens where the radiator clanked through winter nights and medical bills piled up like accusations on a kitchen table that wobbled because one leg was shorter than the others. Ilara Whitmore had learned to move through the world without making sound. At 26, she'd perfected the art of invisibility, the way certain prey animals flatten themselves against the earth and pray the predator's gaze slides past. She'd been a ghost long before she became a waitress, back when she wore scrubs instead of this suffocating black uniform, and saved lives instead of serving overpriced Dover sole to people who wouldn't remember her face. The alarm screamed at 4:30 in the morning, dragging her from dreams that always ended the same way, a man's voice she couldn't quite place shouting something urgent while gunfire cracked in the distance. She'd had the dream since childhood, always waking with her heart hammering against her ribs like it was trying to escape. The studio apartment came into focus around her, all 300 square feet of it, every surface covered with the debris of survival. Medical textbooks she couldn't bear to sell. Bills marked "Final Notice" in threatening red ink. Her mother's oxygen concentrator wheezing in the corner like a dying mechanical beast. Lorelei Whitmore lay in the Murphy bed they shared, her breathing shallow and wet. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer didn't announce itself with trumpets. It crept in like a thief, stealing appetite first, then energy, then hope. The Whipple procedure her mother needed cost $145,000, a number so large it had stopped feeling real. Ilara had called 17 hospitals, pleaded with 12 financial aid offices, and received the same answer in various pitches of bureaucratic sympathy. Without insurance, without assets, without miracles, her mother would die. She pressed 2 fingers to Lorelei's wrist, counting the pulse. 58 beats per minute, thready and irregular. The monitor she'd borrowed from Mount Sinai before they fired her showed oxygen saturation at 91%, teetering on the edge of concerning. Ilara adjusted the nasal cannula, increased the flow to 3 liters, watched the numbers climb to 94. Her mother's eyes flickered open, clouded with morphine and whatever dreams cancer patients had when their bodies were busy eating themselves alive. Nathaniel. The word came out as a whisper, barely audible over the hiss of oxygen. "Forgive me. I hid the Phoenix. She's safe." The same delirious confession Lorelei had been muttering for weeks. Ilara had stopped asking who Nathaniel was, stopped trying to make sense of the fragments. Her mother's past was locked away in a vault Ilara had never been given the combination to. She knew 3 things about her father. He'd left before she was born. He'd given Lorelei a silver locket shaped like a phoenix, and his absence had carved a hole in her mother's heart that 26 years hadn't filled. The locket hung around Ilara's neck, now cool metal against her sternum. Inside was a photograph so faded the man's features had dissolved into ghost light, just the suggestion of dark hair and broad shoulders. She'd stared at it 10,000 times, trying to conjure a face from the blur, trying to imagine what kind of man abandons a woman carrying his child. She showered in 4 minutes flat, the water never getting past lukewarm, because the building's ancient boiler had given up pretending months ago. The face in the mirror looked older than 26. Exhaustion etched into the fine bones of her cheeks, dark circles under eyes the color of winter sky. People told her she was beautiful the way they might comment on a painting in a museum, something to admire from a distance without really seeing. She'd learned to make herself smaller, less noticeable, a skill that served her well in a city that devoured the weak. The subway to Manhattan took 40 minutes, packed shoulder to shoulder with the working invisible, all of them staring at phones or the middle distance or their own failures reflected in the dark windows. Elara counted the stops like rosary beads, each station a prayer she didn't quite believe in. Jackson Heights, Queensboro Plaza, Lexington Avenue. The train shuddered and screamed through tunnels that smelled like brake dust and desperation. The Onyx Hall occupied prime real estate on East 57th Street, the kind of restaurant where reservations were made 6 months in advance, and sommelier meant a man who could make you feel poor with a single raised eyebrow. Elara had been working double shifts there for 8 weeks, ever since Mount Sinai had escorted her out with a security guard's hand on her elbow and threats of prosecution if she ever practiced nursing again without a license. The scandal had been simple. She'd reported Dr. Marcus Hale for stealing fentanyl from the ICU pharmacy, selling it to dealers who worked the streets around Bellevue. She'd documented everything, followed protocol, trusted the system. The system had responded by making her the scapegoat. Hale had friends on the hospital board, family money that bought silence lawyers who could turn a whistleblower into a thief with nothing more than creative paperwork and a suspended nursing license. Now she served food to people who spent more on a single meal than she'd made in a month of saving lives. The irony tasted like copper in the back of her throat. Greg Morrison, the floor manager, intercepted her in the locker room. He was sweating despite the aggressive air conditioning, his florid face shining like he'd been dipped in rendered fat. His eyes never quite met hers, always sliding sideways to check who was listening, who was judging, who might report him for the petty tyrannies he inflicted on the staff. "Table 9 tonight." His voice carried the particular smugness of someone delivering bad news they secretly enjoyed. "You're the only one who hasn't completely crumbled under her yet." Table 9. The words landed like a diagnosis of terminal illness. Everyone who worked at the Onyx Hall knew about Table 9, the corner booth permanently reserved for Nathaniel Blackwood and his collection of hangers-on. The billionaire himself wasn't the problem. He barely spoke, barely looked at the staff, a ghost haunting his own life. It was the woman on his arm who'd earned a reputation that had servers hiding in walk-in freezers and claiming sudden food poisoning to avoid their shift. Vivian Ashford. The name alone made Elara's stomach clench. In the 8 weeks she'd worked here, Elara had watched Vivian reduce 3 waiters to tiers, cost 2 their jobs, and transform the simple act of serving dinner into a masterclass in casual cruelty. She was beautiful the way a knife was beautiful, all sharp edges and glittering surface, 31 years old and holding a 64-year-old billionaire on an invisible leash. The dinner rush built slowly like a storm gathering offshore. Elara moved through her tables with mechanical precision, remembering orders without writing them down, anticipating needs before guests voiced them. She'd discovered that excellent service was a kind of armor, a way to become so useful you were almost forgiven for existing. The kitchen was chaos and heat, chefs screaming in French and Spanish and profanity, the smell of truffle oil and burning butter thick enough to coat the lungs. At 7:15, they arrived. Elara watched from the service station as the hostess led them to Table 9. Vivian, walking like she owned not just the room, but the air molecules everyone else was breathing. She wore something that probably cost more than a year's rent, black silk that moved like water diamonds at her throat that caught the light and threw it back as casual violence. Her hair was the kind of blonde that required a team of professionals swept up in a style that suggested effortless elegance while hiding hours of calculated effort. Nathaniel Blackwood followed 3 steps behind, and Elara felt something twist in her chest when she saw him. He was 64 but moved like a man older, shoulders slightly hunched as if bearing invisible weight. His suit was impeccable, hand-tailored Savile Row, but hung on a frame that had lost substance somewhere along the way. His face held the kind of exhaustion money couldn't fix, deep lines carved around his mouth, eyes the color of winter sky that seemed to look at everything and see nothing. Winter sky, the same color as her own eyes. The thought arrived and departed in the space between heartbeats. Coincidence. Half the people in New York had blue eyes. She smoothed her apron, checked that her hair was still secured in its severe bun, and approached the table with her service smile firmly in place. "Good evening. Would you care for sparkling or still water?" Vivian didn't look up from her phone thumbs moving across the screen with aggressive precision. Still. Her voice was cut glass sharp enough to draw blood. "And tell the sommelier if he brings me the same garbage he served last week, I'll have him fired before dessert." "Of course." "And for you?" Sir Nathaniel's gaze lifted to meet hers, and for a fraction of a second something flickered in those tired eyes. Recognition, confusion. His mouth opened as if to speak, then closed. He nodded slightly, looking away. "Still is fine." The third person at the table was a younger man, late 30s, with Nathaniel's bone structure softened by self-indulgence and sharpened by something harder. Damien Blackwood, the only son, according to the whispered gossip that circulated through the staff room. He had his father's height but none of his gravitas, wearing his expensive suit like costume jewelry, all flash and no substance. His eyes moved over Alara with the kind of assessment that made her skin crawl, the look men give women they've already dismissed as beneath notice. "Bring us the tasting menu." Damien's voice carried the particular arrogance of inherited wealth. "Chef's discretion. And vintage champagne, none of that California swill." The fourth guest was older, early 60s, with silver hair and the careful posture of someone who'd spent a lifetime keeping secrets. Augustus Sterling, and something about the way he held himself suggested former military or law enforcement, that particular stillness of someone trained to observe rather than participate. He was the only one who met Ilara's eyes and nodded politely, a small gesture that felt like kindness in a desert of casual contempt. Ilara retreated to the service station, punching the order into the computer system with hands that wanted to shake. She'd developed a kind of radar for danger after the incident at Mount Sinai, a sixth sense that made her skin prickle when powerful people looked at her too long. Vivian Ashford set off every alarm in her nervous system, something predatory in the way she moved, the way she touched Nathaniel's arm with fingernails lacquered blood red. The sommelier, a pretentious man named Philippe, who pronounced his own name like a sneeze, selected a bottle from the temperature-controlled case with the gravity of a surgeon choosing a scalpel. Moet and Chandon Grand Vintage, $800 a bottle, the kind of excess that could pay Ilara's rent for 2 months. She delivered the champagne, presenting the label for Vivian's inspection. The woman barely glanced at it, waving one hand in dismissal while continuing her conversation with Damien. They were discussing real estate acquisitions, offshore accounts, the kind of wealth management that required teams of lawyers and made the working poor invisible. The first course arrived seared foie gras on brioche, garnished with microgreens that cost more per ounce than gold. Ilara placed the plates with careful precision, starting with Vivian, as protocol demanded. The woman picked up her fork, examined the food with the expression of someone discovering an insect in their salad. "This is cold. It was served at the recommended temperature, ma'am." "Room temperature allows." "Did I ask for a lesson?" Vivian's voice cut like a scalpel. "Take it back. Tell the chef if he can't manage basic competence, I'll ensure my review destroys this establishment." Ilara retrieved the plates, her face carefully neutral, and returned them to the kitchen, where Chef Antoine exploded in a stream of French profanity that needed no translation. He prepared new plates with the kind of rage that made the kitchen staff scatter, muttering about Americans and their palates, educated by fast food and ignorance. The second attempt met with equal disdain. Too much salt, not enough salt. The plating was pedestrian. The portion was insulting. Vivian found fault with each course, like a woman whose primary joy in life came from watching others scramble to please her. Nathaniel ate in silence, barely touching his food, while Damien laughed at his future stepmother's cruelty with the particular appreciation of someone who enjoyed watching animals fight. Only Augustus seemed uncomfortable, shifting in his seat, glancing between Vivian's performance and Ilara's careful composure with something that might have been pity or recognition. The main course was Dover sole, prepared with a technique that required 17 years of training and the kind of precision that bordered on art. Ilara delivered it personally, setting the plate before Vivian with the kind of care usually reserved for handling explosives. "Sea bass." Vivian didn't even look at it. "Steamed. No salt, no oil, no butter. If the chef has put even a molecule of seasoning on this, I will have this place shut down before you clear the table. That's actually sole, ma'am, not sea bass." "Are you correcting me?" The room seemed to contract around the table, conversations at neighboring booths, faltering as people sensed conflict brewing like a storm front. Ilara felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the ghost of old trauma making her skin prickle. Raised voices meant danger. Confrontation meant consequences. Every cell in her body screamed at her to back down, apologize, make herself smaller. Instead, she heard herself say, "I'm simply clarifying the order, ma'am." The slap came fast enough that Ilara didn't have time to flinch. Vivian's palm connected with her cheek with a crack that echoed through the sudden silence, the impact hard enough to snap her head to the side. Pain bloomed bright and hot copper, flooding her mouth where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek. "How dare you speak to me that way?" Vivian was standing now, her voice pitched to carry performing outrage for an audience of Manhattan's elite. "This clumsy cow has been antagonizing me all evening. First, she serves cold food, then she spills water on my dress. Now she has the audacity to argue with me about my order." The lies stacked up like cards in a house that would inevitably collapse, but Ilara knew from bitter experience that truth was irrelevant in the face of power and wealth. She stood perfectly still, tasting blood, feeling the heat spreading across her cheek in the exact shape of Vivian's hand. The locket at her throat suddenly felt heavy, the phoenix burning against her skin. "I apologize." The words came out steady despite the way her hands were shaking. It was an honest mistake. Vivian's purse hung from the back of her chair, expensive leather with brass hardware, the strap trailing across the floor like a tripwire. What happened next would be debated later, reviewed on security cameras, dissected by lawyers and insurance adjusters. Vivian reached for her champagne glass, her movement sharp and sudden. Ilara stepped back reflexively, her foot catching the purse strap. The physics were simple and catastrophic. Ilara's ankle twisted, her balance gone. The tray she'd been holding, loaded with 4 flutes of $800 champagne, tipped forward with the inevitability of gravity. Crystal shattered. Champagne arced through the air in a golden spray, catching the light like liquid fire, and landed directly in Vivian Ashford's lap, drenching $18,000 of Hermes silk. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes disasters, the held breath before the building collapses. Vivian stood slowly, champagne dripping from her dress, from her hair, from the diamonds at her throat. Her face had gone the particular shade of red that suggested blood pressure spiking to dangerous levels. "You." Her voice was barely a whisper, which made it more terrifying than screaming. "You clumsy, incompetent, pathetic little rat." She picked up her wine glass, still half full of Chateau Margaux that cost more per ounce than Ilara made per hour, and threw it. Not at Ilara's uniform, not at the floor, directly into Ilara's face. The wine hit like a slap, cold and sharp, flooding her eyes, her nose staining her skin the color of violence. Ilara gasped, choking on Bordeaux that tasted like humiliation, her vision blurring red. She heard Vivian screaming, felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes watching her drown in public shame. Through the wine streaming down her face, she saw Nathaniel Blackwood. He'd half risen from his chair, his expression hovering somewhere between horror and helplessness. For a moment their eyes met, winter blue reflected in winter blue, and something passed between them that Ilara couldn't name. Recognition, regret, a question neither of them knew how to ask. Then Damien was pulling his father back into the seat. Augustus was rising with napkins he didn't offer, and Greg Morrison was running across the dining room like a man who'd just watched his career spontaneously combust. "Miss Ashford, please, I am so sorry, manager." Vivian's voice cut through Greg's groveling like a guillotine blade. "Fire her, now! And then I want her arrested for assault." She threw that champagne deliberately. I saw her glare at me. She's clearly unstable, probably on drugs. That's not... Ilara started, but Greg's hand was already on her elbow, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "Get your things. You're done." The walk to the locker room felt like the longest journey of her life. Every eye in the restaurant tracking her progress, whispers rising like steam. She'd become a cautionary tale in real time, the kind of story people would tell at dinner parties. Remember that waitress who attacked Vivian Ashford? What was she thinking? In the locker room, she stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror. Wine stained her face like tears of blood, her right cheek already swelling from the slap, her eyes hollow with a defeat that went deeper than losing a job she'd hated. She'd needed this job, needed the insurance that was supposed to kick in after 90 days, needed the tips that barely kept them afloat while her mother's body consumed itself. She touched the locket at her throat, the phoenix cool against her wine-sticky fingers. The photograph inside had survived worse than this. Survived 26 years of questions without answers, survived poverty and pride, and the particular exhaustion of being nobody's daughter. Her phone buzzed. A text from the night nurse she'd hired to check on Lorelei, paid for with tips she'd been saving for the electric bill. "Your mother's oxygen is dropping. You need to come home." The city was weeping when she emerged onto East 57th Street, rain mixing with the wine still drying on her skin, turning the streets into mirrors that reflected the lights of a place that had never wanted her. She stood on the corner, Manhattan flowing around her like she was a rock in a river, expensive cars splashing through puddles, people in $1,000 coats hurrying past without seeing the woman whose life was unraveling in real time. A black Rolls-Royce Phantom pulled to the curb, water sluicing from its polished sides. The back window descended with a whisper of expensive engineering. Augustus Sterling looked out at her with eyes that had seen too much of the world's casual cruelties to be surprised by one more. "Miss Whitmore." His voice was weathered oak, aged and solid. "Mr. Blackwood would like to speak with you." Elara should have walked away, should have disappeared into the rain and the dark and the anonymous poverty where people like Nathaniel Blackwood never looked. But the text about her mother's oxygen levels was still glowing on her phone screen, and desperation made cowards of everyone eventually. She climbed into the car. The interior smelled like leather and old money, climate-controlled to a precise 70 degrees, insulated from the rain and the noise and everything sharp about the world outside. Nathaniel Blackwood sat in the far corner, his face illuminated by the passing streetlights, shadows moving across features that seemed carved from exhaustion. They rode in silence for 3 blocks before he spoke. "I'm sorry for what happened back there." Elara wiped wine from her eyelashes with the back of her hand, the gesture leaving dark smears across her skin. "Your apology doesn't pay my rent." "No, I suppose it doesn't." He was quiet for another block. "That locket you're wearing, where did you get it?" The question was so unexpected that Elara's hand went automatically to her throat, fingers closing around the silver phoenix. "My mother gave it to me. It's the only thing I have of my father. May I see it?" Against every instinct screaming at her to refuse to keep this last piece of mystery safe, she unclasped the chain and handed it to him. Nathaniel's hand shook as he opened the locket, staring at the faded photograph inside with an expression that aged him a decade in the space of a heartbeat. "Where did your mother get this?" "I don't know. She won't talk about my father, just says he left before I was born." Nathaniel's thumb traced the phoenix etched into the silver, a gesture so gentle it looked like prayer. "I gave this to my wife 27 years ago when she told me we were going to have a daughter." The words hung in the climate-controlled air like smoke from a gun. Elara's heart was doing something complicated in her chest, a rhythm that felt like falling and flying simultaneously. "That's not possible. My daughter died." Nathaniel's voice had gone hoarse, raw. "My wife went into premature labor. 7 months. Our baby girl was stillborn. That's what the doctor told me. Then how, I don't know." He looked up, and his eyes were the same winter blue as hers, the same shade that had stared back at her from mirrors for 26 years. "But I need to find out. Will you take a DNA test?" The Rolls-Royce had stopped outside Mount Sinai, the hospital where Elara had saved lives until they decided her integrity was worth less than a doctor's reputation. Rain hammered the roof, a sound like the universe trying to drown out what was being said inside. "Why would you do this? Test a stranger's DNA on the evidence of a locket?" "Because..." Nathaniel's face had gone pale. the kind of bloodless that suggested shock or revelation or both. Because you have my wife's eyes. Because you move like she moved. Because when Vivian hit you, you didn't fight back, and that's what Isabel would have done. Taken the blow with dignity. He pulled out a checkbook Mont Blanc pen, moving across paper with the sound of futures being rewritten. This is $50,000 for your mother's treatment, regardless of what the test shows. Elara stared at the check at numbers that could mean the difference between life and death, between survival and surrender. There had to be a catch. Men like Nathaniel Blackwood didn't hand $50,000 to unemployed waitresses out of sentiment or guilt. What do you want in return? The truth. His voice was steady now, carrying the weight of someone who'd built a $52 billion empire on the foundation of making hard decisions. If you're my daughter, I need to know. If you're not, I need to lay Isabel's ghost to rest. Augustus had appeared with consent forms, medical waivers, the infrastructure of proof and procedure. Elara signed with hands that had stopped shaking somewhere between desperation and possibility. A nurse drew blood, bright red filling the vial, like accusations, like promises, like every answer to every question Elara had never been allowed to ask. The results would take 3 days, 72 hours between who she'd always been and who she might become. Nathaniel gave her a card with his personal cell number, embossed letters that felt like a door opening or closing, impossible to tell which. Stay in the city. He'd already stepped out of the car, rain soaking his $1,000 suit like it was nothing. I'll call you when we know. Elara rode the subway home with a check for $50,000 in her pocket and wine still drying in her hair. The train screeched through tunnels carved from bedrock and desperation carrying her back to Queens, and the studio apartment where her mother was dying and the life she'd built from nothing was crumbling under the weight of a locket shaped like a phoenix. Lorelei was worse. The night nurse met Elara at the door with the particular expression healthcare workers develop when they're about to deliver news that will hurt. Oxygen saturation had dropped to 86% despite maxing the flow, respiratory rate climbing, blood pressure dropping, the body doing what bodies do when they're losing the war. Elara increased the oxygen, checked the monitor, counted the pulse at her mother's wrist. 54 beats per minute, thready and weak. She should call 911. Should get Lorelei to an ER. But emergency rooms meant bills they couldn't pay, meant judgment from doctors who'd see the delayed care and exhaustion and know what poverty looked like when it wore human skin. She pulled up her mother's eyelids, checking pupil response. Equal and reactive. That was something. She palpated the abdomen, feeling for the tumor mass that was consuming Lorelei from the inside out. There, hard and growing, pressing against organs that needed space to function. Mom. She kept her voice low, calm, the tone she'd used in the ICU when patients were circling the drain. Can you hear me? Lorelei's eyes opened, clouded with pain and morphine, but something in them sharpened when they focused on Elara's face. Baby, what happened to you? Only then did Elara remember the wine, the handprint still blooming across her cheek, the violence she'd worn home like a second skin. Nothing. Just a long shift. Nathaniel. Lorelei's hand found Elara's fingers ice cold despite the overheated apartment. The Phoenix. Did you keep it safe? The locket was still in Elara's pocket, warm from being pressed against her hip during the subway ride. She pulled it out silver, catching the dim light. I met someone tonight, Mom. A man who says he gave this to his wife. A man who thinks his daughter died 26 years ago. Lorelei's face did something complicated, cycling through shock and fear and resignation in the space of 3 heartbeats. Her breathing accelerated, the monitor alarming as oxygen saturation dropped to 83, then 80. We need to talk. Lorelei's voice was urgent despite her failing lungs. About your father. About what I did. But her mother's eyes were rolling back, consciousness slipping away like water through desperate fingers. Elara moved fast, pure muscle memory from 4 years of critical care nursing. Increased oxygen to maximum flow. Elevated the head of the bed. Checked airway patency. The numbers stabilized, crept back up to 88, 90, 92. Lorelei had slipped back into unconscious breathing crisis, averted for now, but Alara could read the trajectory. Days. Maybe a week without the surgery? The tumor was winning. She deposited the check at a 24-hour ATM, watching numbers appear on the screen that felt like fiction. $50,000. Enough to schedule the Whipple procedure to buy time to ask the questions that had been locked away for 26 years. The DNA test envelope sat on the kitchen table like Schrodinger's cat, simultaneously containing every answer and no answers until someone opened it. 3 days, 72 hours between the waitress she'd always been and the possibility that she was someone's daughter, someone's lost child, someone who mattered to a man who could write $50,000 checks without blinking. Alara lay down on the Murphy bed beside her dying mother, listening to the oxygen concentrator wheeze and the radiator clank, and the city outside that never slept because insomnia was cheaper than dreams. She touched the locket at her throat, the phoenix that had survived everything, and wondered what it meant that the same man who'd watched her get slapped and done nothing was now claiming she might be his daughter. Somewhere across the river, in a penthouse that probably cost more than Alara would make in her entire life, Nathaniel Blackwood was staring at an old photograph of a woman with winter blue eyes and asking the same question that had haunted Alara since she was old enough to wonder, "Who am I really?" The answer was coming. In 3 days, the truth would arrive in the form of percentages and genetic markers in cold science that would either confirm the impossible or send them both back to their separate lives with nothing but a locket and the ghost of what might have been. But for now, in this moment, Alara Whitmore was still nobody's daughter. Still a waitress who'd been fired for the crime of being in the wrong place when powerful people decided to be cruel. Still a woman watching her mother die while a city of 8 million souls pretended not to notice. She closed her eyes and tried not to think about the way Nathaniel Blackwood's hands had shaken when he opened the locket. Tried not to feel the weight of possibility settling into her bones like snow. Tried not to hope, because hope was the most expensive thing in the world, and she'd learned long ago that women like her couldn't afford it. Outside, the rain kept falling, washing wine from the streets, carrying away the day's cruelties, making everything clean again for people who had the luxury of starting over. And in a studio apartment in Queens, a phoenix hung from a silver chain, waiting to rise. The DNA results arrived on the 3rd day via courier, a manila envelope that weighed nothing, but contained the gravitational pull of entire universes colliding. Alara stood in the hallway of her building, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, holding proof of something she hadn't allowed herself to believe. The percentage printed in clinical typeface read 99.97. Probability of paternity confirmed. She was Nathaniel Blackwood's daughter. The word should have meant something. Joy, perhaps. Relief. The answer to 26 years of wondering why her father had abandoned her, why she'd grown up with a blank space where half her identity should have been. Instead, she felt the particular numbness that comes after trauma, the way the body protects itself from information too large to process all at once. Her phone rang before she could decide what numbness was supposed to feel like. Augustus Sterling's voice carried the weight of carefully managed crisis, the tone lawyers use when they're about to change your life whether you're ready or not. "Mr. Blackwood would like to see you. There's a car waiting downstairs." The Rolls-Royce felt different this time, less like rescue and more like a cage lined in leather and climate control. Augustus sat across from her holding an iPad that glowed with documents she couldn't read from this angle. His expression suggested he'd already seen the test results, already calculated, the implications, already begun constructing whatever fortress of legal protection Nathaniel would need. "I need you to understand something, Miss Whitmore." Augustus's fingers moved across the screen, pulling up photographs that made Alara's breath catch. Nathaniel lost everything when Isabel died, his wife, his daughter. He built an empire afterward, but it was scaffolding around a void. The photographs showed a younger Nathaniel, maybe 37 or 38, smiling with his arms around a woman who could have been Alara's twin. Same bone structure, same winter blue eyes. Same way of tilting her head slightly to the left when the camera caught her. Isabel Blackwood had been beautiful the way certain birds are beautiful, delicate and fierce simultaneously. And in one photo, Isabel stood in profile, 7 months pregnant, one hand resting on the swell of her belly. Around her neck, a silver locket shaped like a phoenix. How did she die? Helicopter crash. 5 years ago, coming back from the Hamptons. Augustus's jaw tightened. The NTSB ruled it mechanical failure, but Nathaniel never believed it. He thought someone tampered with the aircraft. Who would want to kill her? The question hung between them like gun smoke. Augustus didn't answer, which was an answer in itself. The car pulled into an underground garage beneath a building that probably had its own zip code security. So tight, Alara had to pass through 3 checkpoints before reaching the private elevator that would carry her to the penthouse. The doors opened onto a space that redefined wealth. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Central Park. The city spread out like a kingdom someone had conquered and then forgotten why they'd wanted it. The furniture was museum quality, the art on the walls worth more than Alara would make in 10 lifetimes. Everything was beautiful, and nothing looked lived in. Nathaniel stood at the windows, backlit by morning sun that turned him into a silhouette. When he turned, Alara saw he'd been crying. Not recently, but sometime in the last 72 hours, his eyes carrying the particular redness that comes from grief revisited. "I want to tell you I'm happy." His voice was rough, unpracticed at whatever emotion he was trying to name. "That finding you alive is the greatest gift I could have received. But I keep thinking about the 26 years I missed, every birthday, every scraped knee, every time you needed a father and I wasn't there. You didn't know I existed. That's what makes it worse." Nathaniel moved toward her slowly, like approaching a wild animal that might bolt. "Someone took you from me. Someone told me you were dead. And for 26 years I believed them." Do you know who his expression went dark? Something moving behind his eyes that looked like fury, held on a very short leash. "I have suspicions. Augustus has been investigating. But I need you to understand what you're walking into, Alara. My world isn't safe. People who want my money, my company, my influence, they won't be happy that you exist." "I didn't ask to exist." The words came out sharper than she'd intended. "I was doing fine before you found me." "Fine." Nathaniel's tone gentled. "You were fired from a job you hated, caring for a dying mother. You can barely afford to keep alive, living in 300 square feet of poverty while I sit on $52 billion. That's not fine. That's survival." The truth of it landed like a punch. Alara wanted to argue to maintain the dignity she'd built from having nothing but the test results were still in her pocket, and dignity didn't pay for Whipple procedures. "Your mother." Nathaniel's voice changed, became something harder. "Lorelei Whitmore. She worked for me 27 years ago, household staff. She left 1 month after Isabel gave birth." The implication crystallized slowly like frost forming on glass. "You think my mother kidnapped me. I think your mother saved you." Nathaniel pulled up something on his phone, turned the screen toward Alara. Hospital records. St. Vincent's, August 1999. Isabel Blackwood, premature labor, emergency delivery. Baby girl 5.2 pounds, status deceased. But the death certificate was signed by a doctor who drowned 2 years later under suspicious circumstances. The only witness signature was your mother's. And the severance payment I supposedly authorized, $75,000, came from a trust fund I didn't control. Whose trust fund? My son's. Nathaniel's expression could have carved marble. Damien was 12 years old. He shouldn't have had access to those accounts, but his grandfather had set up discretionary funds. Money Damien could move if he had the right people helping him. The pieces began assembling themselves into a picture Alara didn't want to see. A 12-year-old boy who stood to inherit everything if his infant sister died. A doctor willing to fake a death certificate. A housekeeper who disappeared with a newborn and enough money to start over. "You're saying your son tried to kill me when I was a baby. I'm saying someone did. And the only person who knows the truth is in a hospital bed dying of cancer." Lorelei's condition had deteriorated overnight. The $50,000 had bought her a room at Mount Sinai, had scheduled the Whipple procedure for the following week, but the tumor was growing faster than anyone had predicted. Alara had spent the previous night in a chair beside her mother's bed, watching monitors and wondering how to ask questions that might kill the only parent she'd ever known. Now, Nathaniel wanted those answers, and he was willing to pay for the asking. The penthouse came with a proposal delivered by Augustus, with the clinical efficiency of someone executing a business transaction. Elara would move into the guest house, would allow Nathaniel to provide security and support, while they investigated what had happened 26 years ago. In exchange, all of Lorelei's medical expenses would be covered, and Elara would receive a monthly stipend that made her waitressing salary look like pocket change. It felt like selling something she couldn't name. Independence, perhaps. The identity she'd built from having nothing to prove. But Lorelei was dying, and the Whipple procedure cost $145,000, and Elara had learned long ago that pride was a luxury the poor couldn't afford. She signed the papers Augustus presented, each signature feeling like a door closing on the life she'd known. The guest house was a 3,000-square-foot apartment on the Upper East Side, the kind of place where doormen wore white gloves and the elevators required key cards. Elara's entire studio in Queens could have fit in the bathroom. The staff hated her immediately. She felt it the moment she walked through the lobby, the way conversations died mid-sentence, the way eyes tracked her progress with the particular hostility reserved for interlopers. Vivian Ashford had clearly been busy in the 3 days since the incident at the Onyx Hall, poisoning every well she could reach with stories about the gold-digging waitress who'd orchestrated a con to trap a grieving billionaire. The doorman handed her the key card without meeting her eyes. The elevator operator pressed the button for the 14th floor with exaggerated care, as if avoiding contamination. In the hallway outside the guest house, someone had left a note taped to the door. Liars eventually get what they deserve. Elara tore it down, crumpled it, tossed it in the trash chute. She'd survived worse than passive-aggressive notes from people whose biggest struggle was deciding which designer handbag to carry. But the hostility was a reminder that Nathaniel's world had rules she didn't understand, hierarchies where she'd entered at the bottom despite DNA evidence proving she belonged at the top. The apartment should have felt like a gift. Instead, it felt like a museum exhibit, poor girl's first taste of wealth. She wandered through rooms that echoed with her footsteps touching furniture that probably cost more than her nursing degree, staring at art she didn't know how to appreciate. The refrigerator had been stocked by someone who'd clearly never met her, full of organic vegetables and artisanal cheeses, and the kind of food rich people ate when they forgot that hunger was supposed to mean something. Her phone buzzed. A text from Nathaniel. "Dinner tonight, 7 p.m. I want you to meet someone." The someone turned out to be the rest of the family. Nathaniel's penthouse dining room was set for 4 crystal and china arranged with the precision of a surgical field. Vivian arrived first, wearing white like a declaration of war, her expression when she saw Elara suggesting she'd just discovered dog shit on her designer shoes. "You!" Vivian's voice could have flash-frozen nitrogen. "What is she doing here?" Nathaniel stood at the head of the table, his posture suggesting he'd been preparing for this confrontation since the DNA results arrived. "Vivian, I'd like you to meet my daughter, Elara Blackwood." The surname landed like a grenade. Vivian's face cycled through shock, rage, and calculation in the space of 3 seconds, settling finally on the kind of smile that suggested someone planning a murder and enjoying the preview. How convenient. Vivian moved to the bar, poured herself vodka neat. A waitress gets fired for incompetence, and suddenly she's discovered to be the long-lost heiress. "Nathaniel, darling, even you can't be this naive. The DNA test is conclusive." Augustus had entered behind her carrying a folder thick with documentation. "Miss Whitmore is biologically Nathaniel's daughter. We've verified the results through 2 independent laboratories." Vivian drained her vodka, poured another. "So what's the plan? She moves in, plays the devoted daughter for a few months, then challenges the will? Or are we skipping straight to the part where she has you declared incompetent? That's enough." Nathaniel's voice carried an edge Elara hadn't heard before, the tone of someone used to being obeyed. "You will treat Elara with respect, or you will leave." The threat hung in the air like cordite. Vivian's knuckles went white around her glass, but she set it down carefully, her smile sharpening into something that could draw blood. "Of course, darling. Whatever you say." Damien arrived 20 minutes late, his entrance preceded by the smell of expensive cologne and barely concealed contempt. He'd clearly already been briefed, his eyes sliding over Ilara with the kind of assessment usually reserved for livestock at auction. "So this is my long-lost sister." Damien dropped into his chair without greeting anyone else. "Funny how she shows up right when Dad's updating his estate planning, almost like someone's been following the financial news." The accusations came wrapped in civility, delivered with the smile of someone who'd learned early that charm was a weapon more effective than honesty. Ilara sat through dinner feeling like an exhibit in a trial, where she didn't understand the charges, where every answer she gave was catalogued as evidence of guilt or incompetence or both. Vivian asked where she'd gone to college. Damien wanted to know about her employment history, both of them performing concern while hunting for weaknesses for proof that she was exactly what they'd decided. She must be a grifter, a con artist, someone who'd orchestrated an elaborate scheme to steal what they believed was rightfully theirs. Only Augustus seemed neutral, watching the dynamics with the careful attention of someone cataloging details for future use. Nathaniel ate in silence, his exhaustion visible in the slope of his shoulders, the way he pushed food around his plate without actually consuming it. Halfway through the main course, Ilara noticed Nathaniel's hand trembling as he reached for his water glass. The tremor was subtle, the kind of thing you'd miss unless you'd spent 4 years in critical care learning to read the early signs of distress. His color was off too slightly pale, a fine sheen of sweat on his forehead, despite the climate-controlled temperature. "Are you feeling all right?" The question came out before she could stop it, medical training overriding social protocol. Nathaniel waved her concern away. "Just tired. Long week." But the tremor continued, spreading from his hand to his arm. Ilara watched his pupils, noted they were slightly dilated, saw the way he swallowed hard like fighting nausea. The symptoms catalogued themselves automatically. Tremor, pallor, diaphoresis, subtle confusion when Augustus asked him a direct question. Vivian had been pouring wine throughout dinner, her own glass perpetually full, Nathaniel's mysteriously empty whenever she passed. Ilara watched her refill his glass for the 4th time, watched Nathaniel drink without seeming to register what he was consuming. 20 minutes later, Nathaniel stood abruptly, his chair scraping across marble. The room tilted sideways, his balance gone, one hand reaching for the table that suddenly wasn't where he expected it to be. "Dad." Damien's voice carried performative concern. "You okay?" Nathaniel's response was lost as his knees buckled. He went down hard, his head cracking against the edge of the table before his body hit the floor. Blood bloomed across his temple, shockingly red against the white marble. Ilara was moving before conscious thought, muscle memory from 4 years of trauma response, overriding everything else. She dropped to her knees beside Nathaniel, fingers finding the carotid pulse that was there but wrong, too slow and irregular, the rhythm of a heart struggling against something chemical. "Call 911. She was already loosening his tie, checking his airway, tilting his head to protect the cervical spine. Now, Vivian stood frozen, her face performing shock while her eyes calculated something else entirely. Damien pulled out his phone but didn't dial, watching his father convulse with the detached interest of someone observing a mildly interesting scientific experiment. Augustus was the one who called, his voice clipped and precise as he gave the address, the symptoms, the urgency. Ilara barely heard him. Her entire focus had narrowed to the man dying in front of her, to the clinical details. Her training insisted she catalog bradycardia, irregular respirations, altered mental status, pupils now fully dilated. This wasn't a heart attack. The presentation was wrong, the progression too controlled. She'd seen this before in the ICU when patients presented with cardiac glycoside toxicity. Digitalis. Digoxin. Substances that mimicked heart attacks while doing something more insidious, slowing the heart until it forgot how to beat. Her eyes went to Nathaniel's wine glass, still half full on the table. To Vivian, who'd been refilling it all evening. To the way Damien wasn't calling 911 despite his father's brain bleeding out onto marble that probably cost more per square foot than most people made in a month. "What did you give him?" Ilara's voice cut through the shock accusation, sharpening every syllable. Vivian's mask slipped for just a moment, long enough for Ilara to see the calculation underneath. "I don't know what you're talking about." His heart rate is 42, respiratory rate dropping, pupils fully dilated despite the lights. "These are the symptoms of cardiac glycoside poisoning, and I'm betting if we test that wine, we'll find digitoxin." The accusation landed like a bomb. Vivian's face went carefully blank, the expression of someone who'd practiced lying so long it had become reflex. Damien's phone finally found 911, his voice performing distress while his eyes stayed cold. The paramedics arrived in 7 minutes, which in Manhattan was close to miraculous. Ilara briefed them, rapid-fire clinical terminology, stripping emotion from disaster. 64-year-old male acute onset bradycardia, suspected digitalis toxicity, head trauma from fall, GCS-14 and declining. One of the EMTs recognized her. "You're that nurse from Mount Sinai, the one who got fired." The observation hung in the air like an indictment. Ilara felt Vivian's attention sharpen, saw Damien's eyes light with opportunity. A disgraced nurse alone with a dying billionaire. Convenient accusations about poisoning when she was the only one with medical knowledge to know what digitoxin looked like. The narrative was writing itself in real time, and Ilara was cast as the villain. "Check his wine." Her voice stayed level despite the way her pulse was hammering. "You'll find the toxin, and check the bottle it came from. Someone put it there deliberately." The EMTs loaded Nathaniel onto a stretcher, started an IV line, pushed medications that might counterbalance whatever was destroying his cardiac rhythm. Augustus rode with them to the hospital, his expression suggesting he was already 3 steps ahead, already calculating legal ramifications and protective strategies. Vivian and Damien stayed behind, and so did the NYPD. The detectives arrived 40 minutes later, their questions casual at first, the kind of soft approach that lulls suspects into confession. They wanted to know about Ilara's relationship with Nathaniel, about her medical background, about what had happened at Mount Sinai that cost her license. Every answer she gave felt like digging her own grave deeper. Yes, she'd been fired for allegedly stealing controlled substances. No, she hadn't known Nathaniel existed 3 days ago. Yes, she stood to inherit a significant portion of his estate now that paternity had been established. Yes, she had the medical knowledge to know exactly what digitoxin would do to someone Nathaniel's age. And yes, she'd been alone in the dining room with his wine glass for approximately 3 minutes while Vivian was in the powder room and Damien was taking a phone call. The detective taking notes looked up with the expression of someone who'd just closed a case. "Miss Whitmore, we're going to need you to come down to the station, answer some more questions." "Am I under arrest?" "Not yet, but we have a warrant to search your apartment, and Mr. Blackwood's son has filed a complaint alleging you attempted to murder his father to accelerate your inheritance." The guest house search turned up exactly what Ilara expected they'd find because she'd seen enough frame jobs in her nursing career to recognize the architecture of one. A bottle of digitoxin, pharmaceutical grade, hidden in her bathroom cabinet behind the organic face wash someone had stocked for her, a printed dosage chart helpfully highlighting the lethal range for a man Nathaniel's weight, and a handwritten note in what was supposedly her handwriting: 3 doses should be enough, make it look cardiac. The evidence was so perfectly planted it screamed setup. But the detectives didn't care about subtlety. They cared about a clear narrative. Disgraced nurse meets billionaire, seduces him with DNA, evidence poisons him when he updates his will in her favor. "Ilara Whitmore, you're under arrest for attempted murder." The handcuffs were cold against her wrists, metal biting into skin that still smelled like wine from 3 days ago when Vivian had thrown Bordeaux in her face. The symmetry was almost poetic. She'd been humiliated as a waitress, resurrected as an heiress, and arrested as a murderer, all in less than a week. Central booking processed her with the efficient indifference of bureaucracy encountering human tragedy. Fingerprints, mugshot, personal effects cataloged and sealed in plastic. The holding cell smelled like desperation and industrial cleaner populated by women who'd learned long ago that the system didn't care about guilt or innocence, only about clearing cases and filling quotas. Alara sat on the concrete bench and stared at her hands at the fingerprint ink still staining her fingertips and thought about the particular irony of being arrested for saving someone's life. Because that's what she'd done. Nathaniel would be dead if she hadn't recognized the symptoms, hadn't directed the EMTs to treat for digitoxin poisoning. But heroism looked a lot like guilt when you framed it correctly. Her one phone call went to Mount Sinai to the ICU nurse who'd trained her, who'd believed her when everyone else decided she was a thief. The conversation was brief, clinical, focused on the only thing that mattered. "Is my mother okay? The tumor's growing faster." The nurse's voice carried professional sympathy. "Worse, she started having abdominal pain an hour ago. We're monitoring closely. If it gets worse, we might have to take her to OR emergently. Alara, she might not make it to the scheduled procedure." The words should have broken her, should have triggered panic grief, the particular desperation that comes when you're about to lose the only person who's ever loved you unconditionally. Instead, Alara felt the same numbness from 3 days ago, the protective dissociation that happens when reality becomes too large to process. "Tell her I love her. Tell her I'm sorry I'm not there. She'll understand." The nurse hesitated. "Alara, they're saying you tried to kill Nathaniel Blackwood. That's not true, right?" The question hung in the stale air of Central Booking's phone bank. Alara wanted to laugh, to scream, to explain that truth was irrelevant when people with money decided to rewrite it. Instead, she just said no. "It's not true." But the nurse's hesitation before she responded told Alara everything she needed to know about how this story would be received. A disgraced medical professional, a billionaire, accusations of murder. The narrative was too compelling for anyone to question it. Back in the holding cell, Alara closed her eyes and tried to remember what hope felt like. 3 days ago, she'd been nobody. A waitress with a dying mother and a locket full of mysteries. Then Nathaniel Blackwood had appeared with his winter blue eyes and his $50,000 checks and his promise that she mattered, that she was someone's daughter, that she belonged. Now she was right back where she'd started, alone in a cage, waiting for a system that didn't care about her to decide her fate. The only difference was that now she knew exactly what she'd lost. Not just the money or the penthouse or the possibility of a father, but the brief shining moment when she'd believed she might be worth saving. Her cellmate was an older woman, maybe 55, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent more time in institutions than out of them. She watched Alara with the careful assessment of someone who'd learned to read danger in close quarters. "You the one they're saying poisoned that rich guy?" Her voice was surprisingly gentle, like she'd found kindness somewhere in the wreckage of whatever had landed her here. Alara opened her eyes. "I saved his life." "That what you tell yourself, or that what actually happened?" "Both." Alara's laugh was bitter. "I diagnosed digitoxin poisoning and directed the EMTs to treat it. He'd be dead if I hadn't been there, but his son and his fiancée planted evidence in my apartment, and now I'm the one in handcuffs." The woman was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You know what I learned doing 20 years in and out of the system? Truth don't matter. Only what you can prove. I can't prove anything from inside a cell." "Then you better hope someone on the outside believes you enough to do the proving." But who would believe her Augustus was Nathaniel's lawyer, loyal to the family? And the family now included Damien and Vivian, both of whom wanted her dead or discredited, or both. Lorelei was unconscious, about to undergo surgery that might kill her, unable to provide the testimony that could explain what had really happened 26 years ago. Alara was alone. Again. Still. The brief interlude of belonging had been exactly that, an interlude, a momentary fiction before reality reasserted itself. She must have slept because she woke to a guard calling her name. Visitor. The word carried implications she didn't want to examine. It was 3 in the morning, long past normal visiting hours, which meant someone with serious pull had arranged this meeting. Augustus Sterling sat in the interview room looking like he'd aged a decade since dinner. His silver hair was disheveled, his tie loosened, exhaustion written in every line of his face. but his eyes were sharp-focused, the gaze of someone who'd made a decision and was following through despite the cost. "Mr. Blackwood is alive." Augustus's first words chosen carefully. "He's in ICU, stable but critical. They found digitoxin in his bloodstream, exactly as you suspected." Ilara felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of fear she hadn't acknowledged. "He's going to make it." "The doctors think so, thanks to your quick diagnosis and treatment." Augustus pulled out his iPad, the screen glowing in the fluorescent lights. "Which brings me to why I'm here at 3 in the morning instead of home sleeping." He turned the screen toward her. Security footage from the penthouse dining room timestamp dated to earlier that evening. The angle showed the full table crystal clear in high definition. Ilara watched herself sit down, watched Vivian move around the table pouring wine, and there captured in damning clarity Vivian's hand hovering over Nathaniel's glass, something small and white dissolving into the Bordeaux. The motion was quick, practiced the gesture of someone who'd done this before and knew exactly how to hide it. But the camera caught everything. "Why didn't you show this to the police?" Ilara's voice came out rough, unused to the possibility of hope. "Because the police have already decided you're guilty." Augustus's expression was grim. Damien filed the complaint. He provided evidence. He's the grieving son trying to protect his father from a gold-digging con artist. If I show them this footage now, they'll say it's doctored, that I'm part of your scheme. Then what's the point? The point is that I believe you. And Nathaniel, before he lost consciousness, he grabbed my hand and said, "Protect Ilara. Not find who did this. Not call the police. Protect Ilara." Augustus leaned forward, his voice dropping to the register people use when they're about to propose something dangerous. "I need to ask you some questions about your mother, about what happened 26 years ago, because I think whoever tried to kill you as a baby just tried to kill Nathaniel, and I think they'll try again unless we stop them." The questions came rapid-fire, clinical, focused on extracting every detail Lorelei had ever mentioned about her employment with the Blackwood family. Had she talked about Dr. Thaddeus Mercer? About the circumstances of Isabel's early labor? About why she'd left so suddenly with a newborn and $75,000? Ilara answered as best she could, pulling fragments from childhood memories, from the rare moments when Lorelei had let her guard down enough to mention the past. She remembered her mother crying once late at night, whispering, "I did what I had to do. I saved her. God forgive me, but I saved her." At the time, Ilara had assumed her mother was talking about her about some childhood illness or accident. Now the words took on different weight, different meaning. Lorelei hadn't just saved her from death. She'd saved her from murder. "Your mother is scheduled for surgery in 4 hours. Augustus checked his watch. "I've arranged for private security at the hospital. If Damien or Vivian try to get near her, they'll be stopped." "You think they'd hurt her?" "I think she's the only witness who can prove what really happened." Augustus's jaw tightened. "Dr. Mercer is dead. The attending physician from St. Vincent's died in a car accident 5 years ago. Everyone who was present when you were born is either dead or has every reason to lie about it, except Lorelei, except your mother, who's currently unconscious and about to undergo major surgery that she might not survive." Augustus stood gathering his iPad. "I'm working on getting you released, but it's going to take time. In the meantime, I need you to trust me." Trust was a luxury Ilara couldn't afford, a currency she'd spent and lost too many times to believe in its value. But Augustus was the only person standing between her and a murder conviction. The only one who seemed to believe that a disgraced nurse might actually be innocent. "I don't have much choice, do I? No." Augustus's smile was grim. "You don't. But for what it's worth, I think Nathaniel was right about you. You're Isabel's daughter. You have her strength. I don't feel strong. Strength isn't what you feel. It's what you do when you have no other option." He left her in the interview room, promising to return with bail arrangements, with lawyers, with the infrastructure of defense. Ilara sat in the plastic chair and thought about her mother going into surgery without her thought about Nathaniel in ICU fighting for his life. Thought about Vivian and Damien, somewhere planning their next move. The game had stakes now. Not just inheritance or money or family legacy, but lives. Her mother's, Nathaniel's, and her own, because murder charges in New York carried sentences that would consume whatever future she might have imagined. She touched the place where her locket usually hung, but it was gone, catalogued with her personal effects locked away in evidence storage. The phoenix would have to rise without her for now, burning in some plastic bag, while Ilara sat in a cell and waited for dawn. Outside, the city was waking up. Manhattan stirring to life. Millions of people starting their days without knowing that somewhere in central booking, a waitress turned heiress was learning that truth might set you free, but only if you survived long enough to prove it. And time was running out. Bail came through at 6 in the morning, posted by someone Augustus refused to name. Ilara walked out of central booking into a Manhattan dawn that smelled like rain and exhaust. Her clothes wrinkled from sleeping in a cell, her wrists still carrying the ghost pressure of handcuffs. A black SUV idled at the curb, Augustus behind the wheel instead of a driver, his expression grim enough to tell her the news before he spoke. "Your mother's in surgery." Augustus's voice was tight. The surgeon moved up the Whipple procedure. The tumor started bleeding internally 2 hours ago. Emergency intervention. She's been on the table for 40 minutes. They're estimating 8 hours minimum if they can control the hemorrhaging. 8 hours of not knowing. 8 hours of Lorelei's chest cracked open, organs shifted aside, a team of specialists trying to cut cancer out of a woman who'd spent 26 years running from truth. Ilara climbed into the SUV, exhaustion, making her movements mechanical, and wondered if this was what drowning felt like. The slow loss of breath, the dimming of light, the understanding that fighting only made you sink faster. Mount Sinai's waiting room was a study in forced patience filled with people whose lives had narrowed to the width of a surgeon's blade. Ilara took a seat near the window, watching ambulances arrive and depart, the city's trauma flowing through emergency bays like blood through arteries. Augustus sat beside her, his iPad open to documents she couldn't focus on, his presence a kind of ballast against the current pulling her under. "I need to tell you something." Augustus's voice was low enough that the other families couldn't hear. "About Nathaniel's wife. About how Isabel really died." Ilara turned from the window. "You said helicopter crash, mechanical failure. That's the official story." Augustus pulled up a file, photographs of wreckage scattered across water, Coast Guard boats circling like sharks. But the NTSB investigator who reviewed the case sent Nathaniel a private memo 3 years later. The fuel line had been compromised, not worn, not faulty, deliberately cut. Someone murdered her. Someone wanted both Isabel and Nathaniel dead. The helicopter was supposed to crash with both of them aboard. But Nathaniel had stayed in the city for a last-minute board meeting. Isabel flew alone. The implications crystallized slowly. Pieces of a puzzle Ilara hadn't realized she was assembling. Who benefited from their deaths? Augustus closed the file, his expression carrying the weight of suspicions he couldn't prove. "Damien was the sole heir before you were discovered. If Nathaniel and Isabel died together, he inherited everything at age 33. Full control of Blackwood Defense Industries, no oversight, no restrictions. You think Damien killed his own mother? I think someone with access to the helicopter killed her. Damien had that access. He also had motive, and according to staff from that period, he'd developed what his therapists called concerning detachment from emotional consequences." The clinical language barely disguised what Augustus was really saying. Damien was a psychopath who'd graduated from hurting animals to orchestrating murders. Ilara thought about the 12-year-old boy who'd tried to kill his infant sister, who'd paid a doctor to fake a death certificate, who'd learned early that money could buy silence and power could rewrite history. If he tried once and failed, he'll try again. Ilara's voice came out flat, stating fact rather than fear. "He knows I'm alive now. He knows I threaten his inheritance, which is why you can't go back to that apartment." Augustus had already anticipated this conversation, had prepared for it. "I've arranged a safe house in Brooklyn, former FBI witness protection property. You'll stay there until we have enough evidence to arrest him." "What about Nathaniel?" "He's in ICU under guard. 2 former Secret Service agents. No one gets in without clearance. And my mother Augustus's hesitation told her everything. She's in surgery. We can't protect her while she's unconscious on an operating table. But I've stationed security outside the OR. If anyone tries to access that floor without authorization, we'll know. It wasn't enough. Ilara understood hospital architecture, understood that operating rooms had multiple access points, that surgical staff wore masks and scrubs that made identification difficult, that someone with Damien's resources could buy their way past almost any security. But Augustus was offering what he could, and refusing help because it wasn't perfect was the kind of pride that got people killed. The surgery stretched into hours, each 60-minute increment, feeling like a lifetime compressed into waiting room chairs and vending machine coffee. Augustus worked on his iPad building what he called the case will never prosecute evidence that Damien had attempted murder twice, succeeded once, and was planning to finish what he'd started. The file was damning. Financial records showing Damien had lost $40 million in bad investments over the past 3 years. Emails between him and Vivian discussing timeline acceleration and asset liquidation. A background check on Vivian revealing she'd been born. Veronica Kane in Newark had changed her identity after her previous fiancé, a 70-year-old real estate developer, died of a mysterious heart attack, leaving her $3 million. She's a black widow. Ilara scanned the documents, seeing the pattern emerge. She finds wealthy men, seduces them, kills them, inherits. And Damien hired her. Augustus pulled up bank transfers, shell corporations' money moving through layers of obfuscation. He paid her $2 million up front, promised her half his inheritance if she married Nathaniel, and eliminated him within 6 months. Why did she poison him at dinner? Why not wait until after the wedding? Because you appeared. Augustus turned the iPad screen toward her, showing surveillance footage from the penthouse timestamps from the past week. This is Vivian in Nathaniel's study 2 days after your DNA results came back. Watch what she does. The footage showed Vivian at Nathaniel's desk, picking the lock on a drawer with practiced ease. She pulled out documents, photographed them with her phone, her expression calculating as she read. Estate planning documents. The updated will that made Ilara a primary beneficiary. She realized Nathaniel was changing everything, giving you inheritance rights, potentially cutting Damien out entirely. So she accelerated. And when the poisoning failed when I saved him, they pivoted to framing me for attempted murder. Remove the new heir, protect the old one. The pieces fit together with the precision of conspiracy, each element supporting the others. The whole structure designed to ensure Damien inherited billions, while everyone who threatened him ended up dead or discredited. It was elegant in its brutality, terrifying in its simplicity. Why are you helping me? Ilara turned to Augustus, studying his weathered face, the lines around his eyes that spoke of decades spent in proximity to power. You've worked for the Blackwood family for 30 years. Damien is technically your client too. Technically. Augustus closed his iPad, met her gaze directly. But I took an oath when I passed the bar. To serve justice, not just clients. Damien stopped being worth protecting the moment he tried to kill you as a baby. You knew. About what happened 26 years ago, I suspected. Augustus's jaw tightened. I was young then, just starting with the firm. But I remember how Dr. Mercer acted after Isabel's delivery. Nervous, guilty. He drowned 2 years later, and I remember thinking it was convenient timing. Then Isabel died, and I started connecting patterns that should have stayed buried. But you never said anything. Who would I tell Nathaniel was destroyed by grief? The police had ruled everything accidental, and I had no proof, just the instinct that something was deeply wrong in that family. A surgeon emerged from the OR at hour 7, still wearing scrubs speckled with blood exhaustion etched into features hidden behind a surgical mask. Ilara stood before he could speak her name, her medical training reading his body language, interpreting the subtle signals that separated good news from catastrophe. The tumor was aggressive, stage 4 with metastases. We didn't catch on imaging. We resected what we could, but I can't promise we got it all. How long? The question came out steadier than Alara felt. 6 months, maybe a year with chemotherapy. The surgeon pulled down his mask, revealing a kind face worn by delivering too much bad news. I'm sorry. We did everything we could. Can I see her? She's in recovery. Still intubated. But you can sit with her once she's transferred to ICU. The ICU was a cathedral of machines, each bed surrounded by monitors that beeped and hissed and quantified the line between living and dying. Lorelei looked small against the white sheets, tubes emerging from her throat and chest and arms, her skin the color of old paper. Alara took the chair beside the bed, reached for her mother's hand, felt the pulse beating weakly against her fingertips. I need you to wake up, Mom. Her voice was barely a whisper lost in the mechanical breathing of the ventilator. I need you to tell me what happened. Who tried to kill me? Why you ran? But Lorelei was beyond answering, lost in whatever dreams anesthesia provided, her body focused entirely on the work of healing from trauma no amount of surgery could fully repair. Alara sat in the chair and watched the monitors counting heartbeats, measuring oxygen saturation, cataloging the numbers that meant her mother was still alive, even if barely. Augustus appeared in the doorway, his expression carrying urgency. Nathaniel's awake. He's asking for you. The path from one ICU bed to another felt like crossing continents. Nathaniel occupied a corner room, his security detail checking Augustus's credentials before allowing them entry. He looked worse than Lorelei, his face gray beneath the oxygen mask monitors, showing a heart rate still struggling to find its rhythm. But his eyes were open, focused, tracking Alara as she entered. You saved my life. His voice was muffled by the oxygen, each word requiring effort. They told me, digitoxin. You knew. I'm a nurse. Was a nurse. Alara stood at the foot of his bed, maintaining distance, unsure what proximity was appropriate between a daughter and a father who were still strangers despite DNA evidence. I recognized the symptoms. Augustus showed me the security footage. Vivian poisoned me. My own fiancée tried to kill me. Nathaniel's laugh was bitter, cut short by pain. And my son helped her. My son. We can prove it. Augustus moved to Nathaniel's side, his iPad ready. But proving it and prosecuting it are different things. Damien has already filed a restraining order against Alara, claiming she's a danger to the family. He's hired the best criminal defense team in New York. Let him. Nathaniel's hand found the bed controls, raising himself to sitting despite the monitors alarming. I'm changing my will today. Everything goes to Alara, the company, the assets, the estate. Damien gets nothing. That's not what I want. Alara's protest came out sharper than intended. I didn't ask for any of this. I was fine before you found me. Fine? Nathaniel's gaze turned hard, carrying the force that had built an empire. You were a waitress living in poverty, watching your mother die because you couldn't afford treatment. That's not fine. That's survival. The words echoed his earlier accusation, the observation that had landed like a punch because it was true. Alara had been surviving, not living, moving through each day with the mechanical precision of someone who'd learned early that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. I'm your father. Nathaniel's voice softened, became something almost vulnerable. I lost you for 26 years because someone tried to murder you and I was too blind to see it. I won't lose you again to false pride. Pride is all I have left. Alara heard the tremor in her own voice, felt something cracking beneath the armor she'd built from having nothing. Everything else was taken from me. My career, my home. Now my mother is dying despite your money, and I'm facing murder charges for saving your life. So forgive me if I don't want your billions. I just want to know who I am. The question hung in the ICU's recycled air, bigger than inheritance or wealth or family legacy. Who was she? The waitress who'd been fired for dignity, the nurse who'd blown the whistle on corruption, the daughter who'd been stolen at birth, the heiress who threatened a murderer's inheritance. All of it. None of it. Identity felt like smoke, something she could see but never hold. You're my daughter. Nathaniel spoke each word with the weight of vow. You're Isabel's daughter. You're the woman who refused to break when Vivian tried to humiliate you. Who saved lives even when it cost you everything? That's who you are." Before Alara could respond, the door burst open with enough force to make the security detail reach for weapons. A nurse rushed in her scrubs marked with fresh blood, her face carrying the specific panic that preceded code situations. Lorelei Whitmore just crashed. We need family consent for emergency intervention. The sprint back to Lorelei's ICU room happened in slow motion and too fast simultaneously. Alara's medical training cataloged what she was seeing before conscious thought could process it. Monitors flatlining doctors performing chest compressions, the controlled chaos of a code blue in progress. "Get her out of here!" The attending physician barked orders without looking up from compressions. "Family can't be in the room during resuscitation. I'm a nurse." Ilara's voice cut through the noise. What happened? The doctor's hands never stopped moving, counting compressions, monitoring the defibrillator charging. Sudden cardiac arrest. V-fib. We've given 2 shocks, no response. Pushing epi now. Ilara watched the monitor, watched the chaotic electrical activity that meant her mother's heart was quivering instead of beating, watched the doctors work with the mechanical efficiency of people who did this daily, who'd learned to divorce emotion from the mathematics of keeping someone alive. Clear. The defibrillator discharged Lorelei's body arching off the bed. The monitor showed a brief organized rhythm, then deteriorated back into ventricular fibrillation. Again. The attending's voice stayed level. Charging to 360. Clear. The second shock produced nothing. The third, the fourth. After 20 minutes of compressions and medications and desperate electricity, the attending stepped back from the bed, glanced at the clock, prepared to call time of death. Number. Ilara pushed past the security who'd tried to hold her back. "You're not stopping. She's a fighter. Ma'am, we've done everything. She survived cancer surgery 7 hours ago. She survived whatever made her crash." "You're not giving up." Ilara knew she sounded irrational, knew that prolonging code blues beyond reasonable intervention was cruel rather than kind. But this was her mother, the woman who'd sacrificed everything to keep her alive, and she wasn't ready to let go. One more round. The attending's eyes held pity, but he nodded to his team. "One more, then we call it." They shocked Lorelei a 5th time. The monitor stayed flat for 3 seconds that felt like eternity. Then a blip. Another. A rhythm establishing itself, weak but present, climbing from 40 beats per minute to 60 to 80 before stabilizing at a sustainable rate. "We have sinus rhythm." The nurse monitoring vitals sounded shocked. Spontaneous return of circulation. The attending checked the monitors, rechecked them, looked at Ilara with something approaching awe. "Your mother's incredibly lucky. Or incredibly stubborn. She had a reason to fight." Ilara's legs suddenly felt unable to support her weight. "She has things she needs to tell me." The security detail who'd followed her from Nathaniel's room was questioning the ICU staff, their expressions suggesting they suspected what Ilara already knew. This wasn't a random cardiac event. Someone had tried to finish what the cancer hadn't. Augustus appeared, his face grave. They found potassium chloride in Lorelei's IV line, injected within the last 30 minutes, enough to stop her heart. Who had access? Ilara's hands were shaking adrenaline from the code blue, mixing with rage that someone had tried to murder her mother while she was still recovering from surgery. "That's what we're reviewing now." Augustus gestured to the security footage being pulled up on a tablet. But whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Potassium chloride is nearly impossible to detect post-mortem. If your mother had died, it would have looked like surgical complications. The footage showed hospital staff moving through the ICU, masked and gowned, indistinguishable from one another. But one figure moved with purpose rather than routine, entering Lorelei's room at 14:47, spending 90 seconds beside the IV pump, exiting without documenting anything in the chart. "Can you enhance that?" Ilara pointed to the figure's hands, to the way they moved. "That's not a nurse. The technique is wrong. Nurses cap the line after injection. This person just withdrew the syringe." Augustus forwarded the footage to someone, his phone pressed to his ear. "I need facial recognition on this individual." Cross-reference against anyone with connections to Damian Blackwood or Vivian Ashford. And I need it 5 minutes ago. The response came back faster than expected, the kind of speed that suggested someone with federal resources was helping. The person in the footage was identified through gait analysis and partial biometric matching as a contract employee who'd been hired through a shell company owned by one of Damian's offshore accounts. A professional. Someone paid to make murder look medical. Where is he now? Elara's voice was cold clinical, the tone she'd used in trauma bays when emotions would interfere with keeping people alive. Left the hospital 14 minutes ago. Augustus checked his phone. But we tracked him to an address in Dumbo. NYPD is moving now. The arrest happened while Elara sat beside her mother's bed, watching the steady rise and fall of the ventilator, counting each breath like a small victory against death. Her phone buzzed with updates: suspect in custody evidence, secured Damian's name appearing in text messages that explicitly ordered Lorelei's elimination. Augustus arrived with news that felt like vindication and devastation mixed. The contract killer is cooperating. He's given us everything. Damian hired him, paid $200,000, provided hospital floor plans and security schedules. We have enough to arrest him. Then do it. Elara didn't look away from Lorelei's monitors. Arrest him before he kills someone else. The problem is Vivian. Augustus sat in the chair beside her. She's disappeared. Turned off her phone, emptied her apartment, vanished. We think she's running. Let her run. All Elara cared about right now was the heartbeat on the monitor, the oxygen saturation holding steady at 96%, the evidence that her mother had survived another attempt at murder. But Vivian's disappearance meant the story wasn't over, that somewhere, a woman who'd made a career of killing wealthy men was planning her next move. And Elara, newly recognized as Nathaniel's heir, wore a target that money and security couldn't fully protect against. Lorelei woke 3 hours later, emerging from sedation with the confused disorientation of someone who'd been dead and came back. Her eyes found Elara's face, focused with effort, tried to communicate something her intubated throat couldn't voice. Don't try to talk, Mom. You're okay. You're safe. Elara held her mother's hand, felt the returning strength in fingers that had been limp during the code blue. We know what happened. We know someone tried to kill you. But Lorelei's eyes were urgent, insistent, trying to convey information that couldn't wait for the breathing tube to be removed. She gestured weakly toward the notepad nurses kept for intubated patients, managed to grip the pen with shaking fingers. Her handwriting was barely legible, pain and weakness reducing elegant script to desperate scrawl. Damian wasn't alone. Elizabeth helped, his grandmother. The words rewrote everything Elara thought she understood. Nathaniel's mother was alive. Augustus had said she'd died years ago, that Damian's inheritance came from his grandfather's trust funds. But Lorelei was shaking her head, writing again. Not dead. Hiding. She wanted me to kill you. I refused. Took you instead. The conspiracy expanded like a supernova, revealing layers Elara hadn't imagined. Not just a 12-year-old boy trying to secure his inheritance, but a grandmother willing to murder her own granddaughter to preserve family legacy, to ensure Blackwood Defense Industries stayed in the bloodline she approved. Where is she? Elara's voice barely worked. Lorelei wrote an address in the Hamptons, a property Augustus verified through quick research had been owned by the Blackwood family for 3 generations. Listed as vacant since Elizabeth Blackwood's supposed death 12 years ago, but property taxes paid through an offshore account that had Damian's digital fingerprints all over it. She's been alive this whole time. Augustus looked stunned. She faked her death to avoid scrutiny, let everyone think she'd died so she could operate without oversight. The implications were staggering. How many deaths had Elizabeth Blackwood orchestrated? How many inconvenient people had disappeared under the cover of accidents or natural causes? Isabel's helicopter crash, Dr. Mercer's drowning, the attending physician from St. Vincent's car accident, a trail of bodies spanning decades, all designed to protect a family legacy and a fortune that apparently required murder to maintain. We need to tell Nathaniel. Elara stood still, holding Lorelei's hand. He needs to know his mother is alive. that she's been orchestrating all of this. But when they returned to Nathaniel's room, they found it empty. The bed was unmade. Monitors disconnected, his security detail nowhere in sight. A nurse passing in the hallway looked confused when Augustus demanded to know where his client had gone. Mr. Blackwood checked himself out. AMA an hour ago. Against medical advice. He said he had urgent business at his estate. The Hamptons. Ilara's blood went cold. He's going to confront his mother. Without security. Without backup. Augustus was already moving phone to his ear, demanding helicopter transport, calling in favors from federal contacts. A man who just survived digitoxin poisoning, who can barely walk, going to confront the woman who's been trying to kill his daughter for 26 years. The helicopter lifted off from Mount Sinai's roof as the sun began its descent toward New Jersey Manhattan, spreading beneath them like a circuit board lights beginning to glow in the gathering dusk. Augustus piloted with the skill of someone who'd logged serious flight hours, pushing the aircraft to speeds that made the frame shudder. Ilara watched the city disappear behind them, replaced by suburbs, and then the long stretch of Long Island estates scattered like dropped coins along the coastline. Her phone buzzed with messages from the NYPD. Damian Blackwood arrested, charged with conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, and a list of other crimes that would keep him incarcerated for life. But Damian was just the visible edge of something deeper. Elizabeth Blackwood was the root system, the hidden network that had poisoned 3 generations of family with her particular brand of toxic legacy. And Nathaniel was walking into her domain alone, wounded, possibly planning to do something noble and stupid and fatal. The Blackwood estate emerged from the coastline like a fortress perched on cliffs that dropped straight to the Atlantic. The main house was dark except for lights in the east wing windows glowing amber against the twilight. Augustus brought the helicopter down on the lawn rotors, kicking up grass and gravel, the noise loud enough to announce their arrival to anyone paying attention. Nathaniel's car was parked in the circular driver's door, still open, suggesting he'd arrived recently and in a hurry. Ilara ran toward the house, Augustus close behind both of them, aware that every second mattered, that confrontations between family members who'd spent decades lying to each other rarely ended without blood. The front door stood open. Inside the house was silent except for voices drifting from somewhere deep in the east wing. Ilara followed the sound through corridors hung with portraits of Blackwood ancestors, generations of wealthy people who'd built fortunes and families on foundations that apparently required periodic human sacrifice. The voices led to a library, 2 stories of leather-bound books surrounding a fireplace where flames crackled with the smell of burning wood and old secrets. Nathaniel stood in the center of the room, facing a woman who could only be Elizabeth Blackwood. She was 87, but looked 60, maintained by the kind of medical intervention only extreme wealth could buy. Her face was sharp, aristocratic, cold, in the way that suggested emotion was a weakness she'd bred out of herself generations ago. She held a crystal tumbler of what looked like scotch, her posture suggesting she'd been expecting this confrontation and had prepared for it. "Mother." Nathaniel's voice carried no affection, just the flat recognition of biological connection. "You've been dead for 12 years. That's what they told me. I've been protecting this family for 12 years. Elizabeth's voice was cultured, finishing school perfect, each word enunciated with the precision of someone who believed correct diction was a sign of breeding. "Something you clearly couldn't manage on your own. You tried to kill my daughter when she was born. Again last week. You hired someone to poison Lorelei, your daughter." Elizabeth spat the words like they tasted foul. "That woman's bastard, the product of Isabel's weakness. She had an affair, Nathaniel. While you were building the company, she was spreading her legs for the gardener." The lie was so perfectly delivered that for a moment even Ilara almost believed it. But Augustus pulled up his iPad, showed the DNA results, the genetic markers that proved beyond doubt that Nathaniel was Ilara's biological father. "The tests are conclusive." Augustus's voice cut through Elizabeth's performance. "Ilara is Nathaniel's daughter, your granddaughter, and you tried to have her murdered." Elizabeth's facade cracked slightly, something ugly showing through the aristocratic veneer. "I did what was necessary. what I've always done. This family's legacy doesn't get diluted by some nurse's daughter who happens to share Nathaniel's DNA. She's not some nurse's daughter. Nathaniel took a step toward his mother, rage barely contained. She's my child, Isabel's child, and you stole her from us. You destroyed my wife trying to get to my daughter. Isabel destroyed herself. Elizabeth drained her scotch, poured another with steady hands. She was weak, sentimental. She would have ruined everything we built. The helicopter crash was a mercy. The admission landed like a grenade. Nathaniel's face drained of color, his body swaying like he might collapse. You killed Isabel. You murdered your own daughter-in-law. I protected the family. Elizabeth's voice never wavered. Something you've proven incapable of doing. First you married beneath yourself. Then you allowed that woman to bear a child who would dilute the bloodline. Then you nearly married another gold digger. I've spent decades cleaning up your mistakes. Vivian was Damien's choice, not mine. Damien follows my guidance, as he should. Elizabeth moved toward the fireplace, her shadow stretching across the floor like something alive. I've been grooming him since he was old enough to understand what legacy means. He knows what must be sacrificed to preserve it. You made him a murderer. Nathaniel's voice broke. My son, you turned him into a monster. I turned him into a Blackwood. Elizabeth's smile was arctic, something you never truly were. Too soft, too sentimental, too willing to believe love mattered more than power. Ilara stepped into the room, her presence making Elizabeth turn sharply, assessment and calculation flickering across her face. So this is the surviving bastard, the one who should have died 26 years ago. My name is Ilara. Not bastard, not nurse's daughter. Ilara, your granddaughter. You're nothing. Elizabeth's contempt was absolute. A waitress playing dress-up in my son's money. You have no breeding, no education worth mentioning, no understanding of what it means to carry the Blackwood name. I understand what it means to survive people who tried to kill me. Ilara moved to stand beside Nathaniel, her presence anchoring him. I understand what it means to watch my mother fight cancer because she spent 26 years protecting me from you. I understand that legacy built on murder isn't worth preserving. Nobility from the help. How touching. Elizabeth reached behind a bookshelf, her movement casual but purposeful. You know what the problem with this generation is? No understanding of sacrifice, of what must be done to maintain civilization. Her hand emerged holding a pistol, small and silver, the kind of weapon society women carried in purses to charity galas. The barrel pointed directly at Ilara's chest, steady despite Elizabeth's age. You should have died as an infant. Painless, quick. Now it has to be messier. Augustus moved to draw his own weapon, but Elizabeth was faster, shifting aim to him. Don't. I may be old, but my hands are steady, and I've killed before. The confession hung in the air like cordite. How many people had Elizabeth Blackwood murdered to protect a legacy that apparently required constant blood sacrifice? Put the gun down, Mother. Nathaniel stepped between Elizabeth and Ilara, his body blocking the line of fire. This ends now. You're right. It does end. Elizabeth's finger tightened on the trigger. With you. The failure who couldn't protect his family, who let weakness destroy everything I built. The gunshot was shockingly loud in the confined space, the crack echoing off leather and wood and generations of accumulated power. Nathaniel stumbled backward, his hand going to his chest, blood blooming across his white shirt, but he didn't fall, couldn't fall, because Ilara had moved faster than thought her medical training, translating Elizabeth's body language into action before conscious decision. Her shoulder hit Nathaniel's side, pushing him out of the bullet's path, the round passing through empty air where his heart had been. Elizabeth aimed again, but Augustus was moving now, his service weapon drawn, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent a career enforcing law. Drop it. FBI. Drop the weapon now. Elizabeth's smile was ghastly, triumphant, even in defeat. You think you've won? You think arresting an old woman matters? The damage is done. This family is destroyed. And that's exactly what it deserves. She turned the pistol toward herself, barrel pressed beneath her chin, her finger already squeezing the trigger. The second gunshot was quieter somehow, or maybe Ilara's ears were still ringing from the first. Elizabeth Blackwood crumpled with the boneless collapse of the dead blood pooling across imported carpet, her final act of control, ensuring she'd never face justice for the lives she'd taken. The silence afterward was profound, broken only by Nathaniel's labored breathing and the crackle of fire that had witnessed 3 generations of Blackwood violence. Augustus checked Elizabeth's pulse, confirmed what was obvious, his expression grim as he called it in. Federal agents arrived within 30 minutes, the estate flooding with investigators and forensics teams and the bureaucratic machinery that transforms personal tragedy into case files. They found evidence in Elizabeth's study, meticulous records of every murder she'd orchestrated, every life she'd ended, to preserve what she believed was family legacy. She'd kept proof, possibly for insurance, possibly because psychopaths like to document their victories. Dr. Thaddeus Mercer paid $50,000 to declare baby Ilara dead drowned when he demanded more money. The attending physician from St. Vincent's killed when he asked questions about the birth certificate. Isabel Blackwood murdered because she'd discovered her mother-in-law's crimes and threatened exposure. A dozen others spanning 4 decades, people who'd been inconvenient to Elizabeth's vision of what the Blackwood family should be. And at the center of it all, a woman who believed that legacy mattered more than life, that bloodline trumped humanity, that power was worth any price, including the souls of her own descendants. Nathaniel sat in the library long after the body was removed, staring at the space where his mother had stood, trying to reconcile the woman who'd raised him with the monster she'd revealed herself to be. Ilara sat beside him, her hand on his shoulder, silent because there were no words for this kind of grief. "I thought I knew her." His voice was hollow. "My whole life I thought she loved me, loved us. The family. She did, in her way." Ilara had seen enough pathology in her nursing career to understand that love and violence weren't mutually exclusive, that people could genuinely care while simultaneously destroying what they claimed to protect. She just loved power more. The aftermath stretched into weeks. Damien's trial became a media spectacle, every detail of the Blackwood family's crimes exposed to public consumption. He was convicted on 12 counts, sentenced to life without parole, a conclusion that should have felt like justice, but just felt like waste. Vivian was found 3 months later in Monaco, arrested, trying to board a yacht owned by another aging billionaire. She fought extradition, but eventually faced trial, adding another life sentence to the collection. 2 predators removed from circulation, 2 fewer people hunting the vulnerable. Lorelei recovered slowly, her body healing from surgery while her conscience worked through 26 years of secrets. She and Nathaniel spent hours talking, working through the trauma of what had happened, forgiving each other for choices made under impossible circumstances. She'd saved Ilara's life. He'd never stopped looking for his daughter. That was enough to build on. 6 months after Elizabeth's death, Ilara stood in the chapel at Mount Sinai wearing scrubs instead of the designer clothes Nathaniel kept buying her. She'd completed the process of reinstating her nursing license, had been hired back to the ICU with an apology from the hospital board and a settlement that made the wrongful termination lawsuit go away. She could have quit, could have lived off the inheritance Nathaniel insisted on giving her, could have spent her days in the penthouse doing nothing. But that wasn't who she was. She'd built her identity from work and purpose and the knowledge that she could save lives when she showed up. Nathaniel appeared in the ICU break room, moving carefully but without the frailty that had defined him months ago. He'd stepped down as CEO of Blackwood Defense Industries, installed new leadership, begun the process of transforming a company built on his mother's violence into something that might actually serve rather than harm. "You're happy here." He gestured to her scrubs, the ID badge that read Ilara Whitmore, RN, because she'd chosen to keep her mother's name professionally even while accepting her father's legally. "I'm useful here." Ilara poured coffee that had been sitting too long, drank it anyway. "Happy is complicated, but useful, I understand. Your mother's asking when you're coming to dinner." Lorelei had moved into the guest house, her cancer in remission, her days spent gardening and reading and learning to live with the knowledge that she'd done the right thing, even if it cost her everything. Sunday, same as every week. Alara managed to smile. "You're both hovering. I'm fine. You're my daughter." Nathaniel's voice carried the weight of 6 months learning how to be a father. Hovering is in the job description. They stood in the break room drinking bad coffee, a father and daughter who'd found each other too late, but not too late, whose relationship was being built in break rooms and Sunday dinners and the slow accumulation of shared time. It wasn't the fairy tale ending where wealth solved everything, but it was real, complicated, honest. Elara's phone buzzed with a text from a former colleague at the Onyx Hall. Greg Morrison was fired for harassment. New management. They want to know if you'd consider coming back as floor manager. The offer should have been satisfying vindication for the humiliation she'd endured, but Elara deleted the message without responding. She'd moved beyond waitressing, beyond the need to prove anything to people who'd watched her get slapped and done nothing. She was Elara Blackwood now. Nurse. Daughter. Survivor of multiple murder attempts. The woman who'd refused to break when powerful people tried to destroy her. That was legacy worth more than any restaurant position, worth more than the billions sitting in accounts she rarely touched. In the ICU, a patient coded. Alarms screamed. Staff ran. And Elara ran with them back to the work that mattered, back to saving lives, because that's what she knew how to do, back to being useful in a world that often felt designed to crush anyone without power. But she had power now. Not the kind that came from money or family name, the kind that came from surviving, from refusing to be erased, from standing up when standing up might cost everything. That was the kind of power nobody could take away. The kind that burned like a phoenix, rising from ashes again and again, impossible to kill because it was built on something stronger than wealth or legacy or blood. It was built on the simple truth that some people refused to break, no matter what the cost.